Ethan Cole had built an empire from nothing, and he never let anyone forget it. His presence alone commanded attention, the sleek suits, the sharp gaze, the aura of absolute control. He had no patience for inefficiency, and certainly no time for people who faded into the background. And that's exactly what Lily did. She was just another face in the office, a quiet, unassuming employee in the finance department. She never spoke up in meetings, never made a fuss, never tried to impress anyone. To Ethan, she was invisible. Until today. It started with a simple mistake. A report was missing from the morning briefing, and his temper flared. "Who's responsible for this?" His voice cut through the conference room like a blade. His assistant fumbled. I think that's from the finance team." "Then get someone from finance," Ethan snapped. Moments later, the glass door eased open, and in walked Lily. Unlike the others who practically trembled in his presence, she looked calm. Almost indifferent. She clutched the missing report in her hands, stepping forward. "Here," she said softly, placing it in front of him. Ethan barely looked at her before flicking through the pages. "You're late." Lily didn't apologize. She didn't stammer. She just met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "No, I'm not." The room fell silent. Nobody talked to Ethan Cole like that. His eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "The report wasn't due until now," she said matter-of-factly. "I delivered it on time." Ethan's irritation deepened, but beneath it, something unexpected flickered, curiosity. He studied her, expecting nervousness, but there was none. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't arrogant. She was just sure. Something about that unsettled him. Without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving the entire room staring after her in stunned silence. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole had nothing to say. And for the first time in his life, he found himself wondering about a woman he'd never noticed before. Cliffhanger, why did she feel different from everyone else? And why couldn't he stop thinking about her? Ethan Cole didn't believe in distractions. His life was built on logic, efficiency, and results. He made decisions based on numbers, not emotions. But ever since that brief exchange with Lily, she had occupied an unusual corner of his mind. It was infuriating. Sitting in his corner office, high above the city skyline, Ethan found himself staring at his computer screen without reading a single word. He had brushed off their interaction as nothing, but something about the way she had held his gaze, steady, unshaken, stayed with him. Most employees scrambled to please him. She hadn't. He convinced himself it was curiosity. Nothing more. But that theory was tested sooner than he expected. An office crisis. Midway through the afternoon, chaos erupted in the office. One of their biggest clients, an investment firm worth millions, was threatening to pull out of a major deal. The finance team scrambled to assess the damage, while department heads rushed to Ethan's office. "This is a disaster," his CFO muttered, flipping through reports. "We'll lose credibility if they walk." Ethan remained calm, tapping his fingers against the desk. "What triggered this?" "We sent them a cost projection this morning. Apparently, they found something they didn't like. Something we missed." Ethan's voice was sharp, his patience wearing thin. Silence. Then, a quiet voice cut through the room. "They didn't read it properly." Heads turned. Standing near the back of the room was Lily. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Explain." She didn't hesitate. "They're misinterpreting the data. If you look here," she walked to the monitor, clicking through financial statements, "they're assuming these costs apply to them when, in reality, they're part of an internal budget reallocation." Ethan's eyes followed the numbers as she pointed out the discrepancies. The room remained silent as Lily continued, her voice steady, precise. If someone from our side calls them and explains it clearly, they won't walk away. They just need reassurance that their investment isn't at risk. Silence stretched in the office. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching her. The others, men in expensive suits with years of experience, had panicked. But she had dissected the issue in under a minute. He turned to his CFO. Is she right? The man hesitated, then sighed. Yes. She's right. Ethan's gaze snapped back to Lily. She hadn't just solved the problem, she had done it without hesitation, without the need for credit. She had simply known. And that intrigued him. A moment of recognition. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift inside him, an unfamiliar feeling that he couldn't quite name. Most people in his company feared him. Admired him. Obeyed him. But Lily? She simply existed in her own quiet confidence, unaffected by his power. That made her the most interesting person in the building. Cliffhanger: Ethan never paid attention to employees outside his executive circle. But now, he couldn't ignore her. The question was, why? Ethan wasn't used to being caught off guard. Yet, here he was, sitting in his glass-walled office, staring at the latest quarterly reports, but thinking about something, or rather someone, entirely different. Lily. She had done something no one else had ever managed. She had solved a high-stakes problem without hesitation, without seeking credit, and without fearing him. That should have been the end of it. But Ethan found himself restless, his mind lingering on her. Why hadn't he noticed her before? Who was she? A growing curiosity. A man like Ethan didn't dwell on employees. He had people for that, managers, assistants, HR. Yet, the next morning, as he stepped into his office, he found himself asking his assistant a question he normally wouldn't care about. How long has Lily worked here? The assistant blinked, caught off guard. About a year, I think. A year? She had been under his nose all this time. He frowned. Where did she work before? The assistant hesitated. I don't know, sir. She's not high-level staff. Ethan didn't respond, but the answer didn't sit right with him. A woman like Lily, who could handle numbers faster than his senior team, who could keep her composure under pressure, should have been on his radar. So why wasn't she? The search for answers. Later that day, he did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled up an employee file himself. Lily's resume was unremarkable. A finance degree, a couple of small jobs before this one. No major achievements, no high-profile recommendations. It didn't make sense. People like her didn't just blend into the background. His eyes narrowed when he spotted something unusual. There was a 2-year gap in her employment history. A gap she hadn't explained. Ethan wasn't the type to pry into personal lives, but something about that missing time nagged at him. What had happened in those 2 years? And why did he care? An unexpected moment. By the end of the day, he still had no answers. But fate had a way of delivering them. As he left the office late that evening, he spotted Lily in the nearly empty break room. She was sitting alone, a worn notebook in her hands, completely unaware of his presence. For a moment, he hesitated. He never engaged in casual conversation with employees. It blurred lines, created unnecessary complications. But then he saw her hand tighten slightly around the notebook. There was something in her eyes, something distant, as if she were lost in another time, another place. Before he could stop himself, he stepped forward. Long day? Lily looked up, startled. For a brief second, emotion flickered across her face, something raw, something unguarded. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Yes, she said simply. Ethan gestured to the notebook. What's that? She hesitated. Then, to his surprise, she handed it to him. He opened it and found pages filled with complex financial projections, numbers, patterns, strategies. It wasn't just notes. It was brilliance. "You do this, for fun?" he asked, intrigued. Lily gave a small, almost shy smile. "I like understanding how things work." Ethan glanced at the pages again, something shifting inside him. She wasn't just smart. She was exceptional. And she had been hiding in plain sight. Cliffhanger, but why? Ethan Cole didn't make a habit of being curious about his employees. Curiosity led to attachment, and attachment led to distractions. He ran a billion-dollar company, he didn't have time for distractions. But as he sat in his office the next morning, reviewing reports with the CFO, he wasn't listening. His mind kept drifting to last night, to Lily's notebook, to her quiet confidence, to the way she had looked at him when he asked about it. There was something about her. Something hidden. And for the first time in years, Ethan wanted to understand. The charity gala. His opportunity arrived faster than expected. That evening, Ethan was obligated to attend an exclusive charity gala, a room full of CEOs, politicians, and socialites, all pretending to care while flashing their wealth. Normally, he tolerated these events with the patience of a man serving a prison sentence. But tonight, something unusual caught his attention. Lily was there. Dressed simply, nothing flashy, yet somehow more striking than the designer-clad women who floated through the ballroom. She was standing near the back, away from the crowds, as if she didn't belong. Ethan frowned. His company had sponsored this event, but lower-level employees didn't usually attend. So why was she here? An unexpected encounter. Without thinking, Ethan crossed the room, ignoring the small talk and the handshakes thrown his way. When Lily saw him approaching, she stiffened, her posture guarded. "Didn't expect to see you here," Ethan said, stopping beside her. She hesitated. "I used to do volunteer work with this foundation." Her voice was even, but something about the way she said it caught his attention. Ethan glanced at her, then at the room full of millionaires sipping expensive champagne. "You don't seem like the type who enjoys these events," he said. "I don't," she admitted. "Then why come?" Lily looked away, her fingers tightening around the delicate clutch in her hands. "Because it matters," she said finally. Ethan studied her, intrigued. "You don't seem like someone who does things just to impress others." She let out a quiet breath. "That's because I'm not." A glimpse into the past. For a moment, there was silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was something else. Something heavier. Then, before he could stop himself, Ethan said, "You're different from everyone else here." Lily turned to him, her expression unreadable. "So are you." Ethan smirked slightly. "Oh? And what does that mean?" Lily hesitated. Then, with a small, almost knowing smile, she said, "You pretend to belong in a room like this. But I don't think you do." For the first time in a long time, Ethan had no immediate response. No one had ever said that to him. He was the CEO, the man who could command a room with a single glance. But in that moment, under Lily's quiet scrutiny, he felt exposed. And the strangest part? He didn't hate it. A silent understanding. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ethan was pulled into conversations, forced to shake hands and nod at empty words. But his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing at Lily across the room, watching the way she avoided attention, the way she seemed lost in thought. And for the first time, Ethan realized, he wasn't just intrigued by her. He wanted to understand her. Cliffhanger, but understanding her meant stepping into a world he had long avoided. Was he willing to do that? Ethan had never been accused of being reckless. Every decision he made was calculated, controlled, and executed with precision. That's how he built his empire. That's how he stayed on top. But Lily? She was becoming a variable he hadn't accounted for. For days after the gala, he found himself watching her more closely. Not in the way he scrutinized business reports or market trends. This was different. He noticed the way she avoided the spotlight, the way she disappeared into the background. Yet, somehow, he couldn't look away. And that was dangerous. Because the moment you start caring, you lose control. A mistake that changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday. Ethan was in a meeting with his senior team, discussing an upcoming merger. Tensions were high. The numbers weren't aligning, investors were nervous, and the pressure was mounting. Lily was there, as she had been for weeks now, always quietly observing, offering insights no one else could see. Then, in a rare moment, she spoke up. "The projections are off because you're underestimating the market shift," she said. The room fell silent. Ethan looked at her, surprised. "Explain." Lily didn't hesitate. She leaned forward, pointing at the numbers on the screen. "If you factor in the consumer trends from the last 6 months, the valuation changes. The investors aren't pulling back because they doubt the company. They're pulling back because they think you're overvaluing it." The room remained still as the weight of her words settled. She was right. But Ethan didn't acknowledge it. Instead, for reasons he couldn't explain, he reacted differently. Maybe it was because she had spoken so confidently, challenging him in front of his team. Maybe it was because he had been thinking about her too much, and he needed to remind himself who he was. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because she had begun to matter too much. So instead of agreeing, he dismissed her. "You're assuming trends will remain stable," he said coolly. "That's a risky assumption." Lily blinked, taken aback. "It's not an assumption. It's based on data." Ethan held her gaze. "Then prove it before you make suggestions." The words were sharp, final. A dismissal. The energy in the room shifted. People looked away, sensing the tension. Lily hesitated for only a second. Then, without another word, she closed her notebook, nodded, and left the room. A realization too late. The moment she walked out, Ethan felt it. The mistake. The loss of something intangible. She hadn't argued. She hadn't fought back. She had simply left. And for some reason, that unsettled him more than anything else. The meeting ended, but he barely remembered the rest of it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene in his head. Why had he done that? Lily had never challenged him out of arrogance or ego. She had only ever spoken when she knew something was worth saying. And he had shut her down. The next day, a void in the office. By the next morning, Ethan realized just how much her presence had changed things. Lily didn't come to the usual meetings. She wasn't in the office early, like she always was. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Maybe she was just taking a break. Maybe he was overthinking it. But by noon, she still hadn't appeared. That's when his assistant hesitantly knocked on his office door. "Sir," she said carefully, "Lily called in sick today." Ethan stilled. Lily never called in sick. Something in his chest tightened, though he refused to name the feeling. For the rest of the day, he told himself it didn't matter. That he had made the right decision. But deep down, he knew the truth. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole regretted something. Cliffhanger, but was it too late to fix it? Ethan Cole had never considered himself the kind of man who made mistakes. He built his success on calculated decisions, cold logic, and an unshakable belief in his own judgment. But as he sat in his office, staring at the empty space where Lily should have been, he couldn't ignore the truth. He had messed up. The silence in the office felt different without her presence. It wasn't like he spoke to her every day, but she had become noticeable. Her quiet strength, her sharp mind, the way she saw problems before anyone else. And now, she was gone. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't know how to fix something. A search for answers. By the afternoon, his patience wore thin. He needed to know why she hadn't come in. His assistant had said she was sick, but something about that didn't sit right with him. So, against every instinct telling him to mind his own business, he did something he had never done before. He looked up her employee address. And then, before he could stop himself, he was in his car, driving toward it. An unfamiliar world. Lily didn't live in the kind of high-rise apartment buildings his executives favored. She didn't live in a sleek, modern home with security gates and imported marble floors. Instead, Ethan found himself parking in front of a small, modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. It was quiet. Humble. And somehow, it suited her. He hesitated for only a second before stepping out of his car and heading to the door. Knocking once, he waited. No answer. Knocking again, he felt a strange unease settle over him. Then, just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open. Lily stood there, wearing an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She looked tired. Not sick. Just exhausted. The sight of her like this, unguarded, vulnerable, hit him harder than he expected. A conversation that changed everything. Lily blinked up at him, clearly surprised. "What are you doing here?" Ethan didn't have a good answer. So he went with the truth. "You didn't show up to work." She frowned. "I called in." "I noticed," he admitted. "And I wanted to know why." Lily crossed her arms, studying him. "I wasn't feeling well." It was a lie. Not a complete one, but a lie nonetheless. Ethan wasn't sure why, but he didn't want to let it go. "Is this about yesterday?" he asked. Something flickered across her face, something brief, but undeniable. "No," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Look, about what happened." "You don't have to explain," she interrupted, her tone even. "I understand how you work, Mr. Cole." Something about the way she said his name, formal, distant, made his jaw tighten. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. That it wasn't just business. But even now, he wasn't sure he could admit that to himself. So instead, he took a different approach. "You were right," he said. "About the projections." Lily looked up, startled. He continued, his voice steady. "I ran the numbers again. You were right, and I dismissed you." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a soft voice, she asked, "Why are you really here?" Ethan didn't have an answer. At least, not one he was ready to admit. Cliffhanger, but the truth was coming, whether he was ready or not. Ethan Cole had spent his entire life making difficult decisions. He had fired employees without hesitation, closed billion-dollar deals in the blink of an eye, and turned struggling companies into powerhouses with nothing but ruthless efficiency. But standing outside Lily's apartment, watching her guarded expression, he found himself facing a choice unlike any other. And for the first time in his life, he hesitated. An honest conversation. Lily leaned against the doorframe, waiting. She had always been patient, always composed. But now, there was something else in her posture, an exhaustion that went beyond missing one day of work. Ethan wanted to ask what had happened. He wanted to know why she looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. But instead, he simply said, "You don't belong in the background." Lily's brows furrowed. "What?" "At work. You hide. You downplay your skills. You let people overlook you." His voice was calm but firm. "Why?" Lily exhaled softly, looking away. Not everyone needs to be in the spotlight, Ethan. It was the first time she had ever said his name. And something about that small shift made his chest tighten. You're not just anyone, he countered. You see things others don't. You solve problems before they exist. He hesitated, then sighed. You're different. Lily let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. I don't know if that's a compliment or a warning. Maybe both, he admitted. A hidden past. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Lily spoke. I used to be someone else, she said, her voice quieter now. Before this job, before I decided to blend in. Ethan stayed quiet, letting her continue. I worked for a company where I didn't have the luxury of hiding, she said. I was young, ambitious. I made a name for myself. But I trusted the wrong people. A shadow crossed her face, and Ethan felt something inside him tighten. What happened? Lily hesitated, then said, they took credit for my work. Every idea, every strategy, I built something for them, and they erased me from it. She let out a breath. So I left. And I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again. Ethan clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. He had seen corruption in business before, but hearing it from her, seeing the way it had affected her, made it feel personal. You shouldn't have had to run, he said. Lily met his gaze, something unreadable in her eyes. Sometimes, running is the only way to survive. Ethan's offer. A realization hit him then. Lily wasn't just a brilliant employee. She was someone who had been burned, someone who had been betrayed by the very system he thrived in. And she had chosen to disappear because she thought it was the only way to move forward. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man who let talent go to waste. I want you to run the department, he said suddenly. Lily's eyes widened. What? I'm offering you a promotion, he said, stepping forward. No more hiding. No more blending in. You deserve more than that. Lily shook her head. Ethan, Don't say no, he interrupted. Not yet. She stared at him, searching his face for something. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't sure what she would decide. Cliffhanger, would she take the offer, or walk away forever? For a long moment, Lily said nothing. Ethan had made offers before, partnerships, deals, contracts worth millions. He was used to people jumping at the opportunity to work with him, to be elevated by him. But Lily wasn't like those people. And when she finally spoke, her answer was the last thing he expected. I can't take it, she said softly. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted. Why not? Lily exhaled, crossing her arms. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. I took this job to disappear, Ethan. To avoid everything that made me miserable before. She paused, then added, including men like you. Her words hit him harder than he expected. Men like me, he repeated. She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Powerful. Charismatic. Used to getting what they want. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something raw in her eyes. I've seen how this story ends. Ethan clenched his jaw, realizing that this wasn't just about business. It was about trust. And he wasn't sure he had earned hers. A change in strategy. Ethan wasn't a man who begged. But as he stood there, looking at her, really looking at her, he realized that if he walked away now, he might never see her again. And the thought of that left an unfamiliar ache in his chest. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly, he said finally. I'm asking you to see what happens when you don't run. Lily hesitated. Give me 1 week, he continued. 1 week where you let yourself be seen. If you still want to disappear after that, I won't stop you. Her eyes searched his, as if trying to decipher what kind of man he truly was. Then, slowly, she nodded. Fine, she said. 1 week. Ethan felt the tension in his chest ease. It wasn't a victory, at least, not yet. But it was a start. The unexpected goodbye. The next morning, Ethan walked into the office feeling something he hadn't in a long time, hope. But that hope was shattered the moment his assistant rushed into his office, her face pale. Sir, I think you need to see this. She handed him a letter. A resignation letter. From Lily. Ethan stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. She hadn't given herself a week. She had left. Without a word. Cliffhanger, had he lost her forever? The resignation letter was brief, nothing more than a few lines of formal text. Dear Mr. Cole. After much consideration, I've decided to resign from my position. I appreciate the opportunities you've given me, but I've realized that I need to move on. This decision is final. Best regards. Lily. Ethan sat in his chair, the weight of the letter pressing down on him. It was like a punch to the gut, one he hadn't seen coming. He knew what it meant. Lily had left. She had chosen to walk away, just like she always did, just like she had before. But as the hours ticked by, the anger and frustration slowly turned to something else. Something he didn't expect. Regret. A decision that felt too late. Ethan had spent his entire life making decisions without second-guessing himself. Business deals, mergers, investments, everything had been about the next step, the next opportunity. But with Lily, it had always felt different. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had been so wrapped up in controlling the situation, so caught up in his own power, that he never truly saw her. Not the way she deserved. She hadn't walked away from the job, she had walked away from him. And that was a hard pill to swallow. A risk worth taking. As the evening drew near, Ethan stood up and paced across his office. He looked at his phone, at the email where he had offered Lily the promotion, and a sudden thought struck him. What had he been waiting for? Why had he expected her to stay? He had offered her a way out, but it wasn't the right way. He had asked her to trust him without giving her a real reason to. Ethan knew he had one last chance, and he couldn't waste it. He grabbed his jacket, his mind made up. The final stand. Lily wasn't at her apartment when he arrived, but Ethan wasn't leaving until he found her. The streets were cold, the sky painted in shades of gray, but he didn't care. The city felt empty without her presence, and for the first time, he realized how much he had taken her for granted. He made his way to the small cafe where they had shared their first real conversation weeks ago. The door jingled softly as he entered, scanning the room. And there she was. Lily sat by the window, her head down, lost in a book. She hadn't seen him yet. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, watching her. She looked calm, peaceful, even content. And yet, he knew she wasn't. When she finally looked up and saw him standing there, her face hardened. But there was something else in her eyes, something softer, something he hadn't noticed before. He walked up to her slowly, each step heavy with the weight of the moment. I messed up, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily didn't say anything, but her eyes told him everything. She wasn't angry, she was hurt. I should have never pushed you away, he continued, swallowing the lump in his throat. I've been blind, thinking that power and control were everything. But what I've realized is, it's not. You're not just an employee, Lily. You're not just a part of my company. You're. He paused, searching for the right words. You're someone I admire. Someone I want to build something with. Not because you're talented, though you are. But because you're real. You make me want to be a better person. And I've messed up, but I'm asking you for one more chance. Lily looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. The tension between them was palpable, but in that moment, something shifted. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft. Why now? Why after everything? Ethan met her gaze without flinching. Because I see you, Lily. And I see what I missed all along. I can't make up for what I did, but I can start by being honest with you. I'm not asking you to trust me right away. But I am asking for a chance. To prove that I can be someone worth trusting. Lily stood up slowly, her hand lingering on the table. She was quiet for a long time, as if weighing her decision. And then, finally, she nodded. All right, she said softly. But no more games. If I'm going to give you a chance, it has to be real. No more hiding. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Agreed, he said, his voice steady. As they stood there, the silence between them felt like a new beginning. A beginning that wasn't based on control, power, or expectations, but on trust. The lesson. As Ethan walked out of the cafe, side by side with Lily, he realized something. The world he had built, his empire, had always been about him. About what he wanted, how he wanted it. But now, it wasn't just about him. It was about them. And for the first time, he understood that true power didn't come from controlling everything around him. True power came from trusting others, allowing them to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued for who they truly were. That, he realized, was the most unexpected lesson of all.